Our next keynote speaker to the podium, Dr. Mark Ware. He is probably one of the first individuals in Canada that took a real serious academic interest in the potential therapeutic potential of cannabis as far back as 2001. He's trained as a family physician. He has a strong track record in academic research. He spent some time in academia as the medical director for Canopy, helping them to embark on a series of initiatives to understand where the evidence lies for possible therapeutic use of cannabis. He's now back at McGill University. He's taken on the Alan Edwards Chair in Clinical Pain. So again, he practices clinically, he does research, he's consulted broadly to government, and he's here to summarize in a brief 30 minutes all of his experiences over the past 5 years. So good luck, and please join me in welcoming Doctor to the podium.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I was beginning to have a panic attack. It's like half an hour. I got to go really fast. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, James. Thank you all for inviting me. And yes, when James asked me to give a talk on the last 5 years in pain, medicine, and cannabis, I said, Jason, you do know where I've been for the last 5 years, right? I was the chief medical officer at Canopy Growth Corporation, one of Canada's licensed producers. And you know, I'm recognizing the mood of the room and industry. Often people come up to me and say, you know, how was it over there? And never mind the racial epithets, but, you know, the dark side and on the other side of the coin, and how was it working over there with those bad guys in industry? What I like to try to do, and without trying to be an apologist for some of the bad behaviors that I know industry is capable of and the risks of commercialization, is to present a perspective that we need to have that side of the equation involved in discussions around legalization. And my particular interest is in medical applications of cannabinoids. And I noticed that for a lot of the session here, we're talking about public health risks, and we're not really dialing down on the patient. And the whole reason why we have a medical cannabis program in Canada dates back for those of you who remember when patients advocated for access to legal cannabis for medical uses. And that really was the beginning. And I never let go of that memory that there are people out there, and I work now in a pain clinic. We have 15 to 20 referrals for severe chronic pain every single day on our fax machine coming in from the Montreal General. 15 to 20 referrals a day for chronic pain. It is a massive public health epidemic. And so anything that we can do to try to find ways to solve, to help relieve pain, to help address the crisis is work that's noble and important in my view. So what I'd like to try and do is take you through a bit of a journey through 5 years of industry research with a sort of looking in the rearview mirror type of approach. So I'm looking back now at what happened. And there were lots of times during this last 4 years working in the corporate world where things are happening so fast, you really have very little time to see the world going by you. You're focused on deliverables, on reports, on performances. Of course, COVID hit during all of this, so everything went completely sideways. But what I'd like to do is look in the rearview mirror, and it was a really nice opportunity to look back and say, what did we achieve in those 4 years that can lend some importance to the dialogue around the safety and efficacy of cannabinoids in managing pain, and you know, let's be realistic, it extends to other conditions as well. So that's me now. Oops. Conflicts of interest. So I've done a fair bit of consulting over many years in my career, but the most significant conflict that I would need and must declare is this 4 years spent as Canopy Growth's chief medical officer. I still own some shares. They're not worth very much right now, but I do need to disclose that I still have a very small shareholder stake. And what I try to do to mitigate this risk of bias is everything I'm going to present to you here is taken from peer-reviewed published literature. So while I could do another talk around the insider scoop on what it was like being in industry, that probably would get me into legal jeopardy. So let's stick to the science and the peer-reviewed published work. And so what I'm going to try and do is tell the story through the lens of peer-reviewed publications. And I love this quote. I couldn't help it. pull this off of James's thing. We are pro-data and pro-science. So that's the lens I'm taking here. This is going to be focusing in on what it was that we found, and there will be challenges, limitations, as there are with any kind of trial, any kind of study. But the important thing is we left a trail of data, and so you help me judge whether we succeeded or what lessons we can learn from this. So what was my job at Canopy Growth? When they hired me, it was essentially to manage the medical research and development program and to oversee product safety. Those were the two major focuses, or foci. And to do that, we created essentially a pharmaceutical company within the commercial enterprise that was Canopy Growth. And Canopy Growth grew from multiple small medical producers. They were gradually bought up and accumulated a larger body called Canopy Growth. And so the Canopy Health Innovations was our team. And essentially at the peak, I think we had about 25 people. And we hired headquartered in Montreal, and we hired from the pharmaceutical sector. And Montreal has a vibrant hub of biotech and biopharma companies. And I have to say right at the outset, for any of you, for grad students or for anyone exploring this, some of the people that we hired that worked with me for 4 years at Canopy are some of the smartest, most motivated, dedicated scientists I've ever had the pleasure of working with. These guys worked hard and focused. And when you see the body of work, if I had a lab for 4 years with that kind of staff, we produced this kind of level of output, I would have been very, very, very happy as an academic. But suffice to say that the industry is a place where many people work who work extremely hard and extremely dedicated. So I just want to make a shout out that a lot of what I'm presenting is not me. I was lucky enough to be the chief of the top of the pile, but these were the people that did all the work. And it was a really, really eye-opening experience to work and see how smart some of the folks that come out of industry were. We had some product safety teams, quality control, quality assurance, medical science liaisons, preclinical scientists, veterinary scientists, people doing our animal research, clinical trials, managers, clinical research nurses, remarkable, remarkable people. Can I back up? Yeah, so what we were responsible for was, and the way I'll present this session is looking at drug development, because we were trying to develop medicines using cannabis. How did we produce guidance for clinicians during a period of time where we were trying to gather data? And finally, pharmacovigilance, which I think is a much underrated, important contribution to the science, particularly the safety of products in general, but cannabis specifically. So let's focus a little bit on the drug development work. And some of these, I apologize, the slides are very dry. It would have taken a long time to go through slide by slide, looking at every single paper. And for some of this, my memories are weaker. So please don't ask me too many details about some of the studies. The data is all published. They're all in peer-reviewed literature and all in open access journals. So you can find all of this work. But I'm going to try and go through quite quickly what it was and the approach that we took. So when you begin developing a medicine for regulatory approval, you have to start at the preclinical phase. Regulators expect you to produce a dossier that explains why your product is safe enough to be used in human use. And that includes using preclinical research. For a lot of what's happened in the cannabis world, there's been a huge volume of work on THC and other cannabinoids looking in animal studies and preclinical models. But there was a huge gap in the CBD literature. So a lot of what we did early on was to start looking at classical preclinical studies of cannabidiol with an eye that potentially this was one of a new and emerging molecule, essentially. So we looked at the pharmacokinetics of CBD in oral and inhaled preclinical rat studies. We looked at the developmental and reproductive toxicity, and these are regulatory required studies. If you're going to produce a drug in the market, you have to do this work. Effect of CBD on long-term, this was an interesting study, long-term toxicity and lifespan of the preclinical Caenorhabditis elegans, which, if you don't know what that is a worm. And I'll show you some interesting findings that we found from that. And then another study where we looked at inhaled vehicles for inhaled products. And this was another story that I'll share with you in a moment. But let's So the PK studies are fairly dry. There's not much, and we didn't discover anything particularly new, but we put the data out there. But the CBD and long-term toxicity, there is no study to date that's looked at long-term use of CBD. And people that take CBD as a supplement or use it will often take it for months, if not years. So there was no model that had looked at animal studies modeling out the lifetime exposure to CBD. And this earthworm model is actually a very robust model. It's a fairly complex organism, the worm. It has a very complex neurological system, digestive system, mobility. So it's used as a drug screening tool for people who are looking at long-term exposures to different products. So we ran a worm study with CBD. Basically, they swim in a little tank for as long as they're alive. They live about 20 days on average. So you look at these things, you look at how wiggly they are, and you look at how long they live. So we bathed these poor little worms in CBD and looked at how long they stayed alive. And you can see on the top left curve in blue the control animals. And as you increase the dose of CBD that they're exposed to, you see essentially the number that were left alive was extended. When we ran the analyses at the bottom of the graph, you can see that the lifespan was extended in these worms by about 15%, especially the group that had the 40 micromolar CBD bath. They were living on average 18% longer than their control animals. So you can imagine the results in the unblinding, and we're reading this and going, oh my God, CBD extends life expectancy in worms. The study never got taken anywhere. The data's out there, but this is the kind of discovery that you get when you do these sorts of work. They were also more active. These animals that were exposed to CBD, they wiggled more, and the amount of time they spend outside a certain circle of radius is what tells you how active they are. And so these animals, not quite in a dose-dependent way, they were slightly more active in the 40 microgram. By the time you got to 100 micromolar, they were less active, but they seemed to be more active. Even the older worms kept wriggling around more than the control animals. Switching gear, one of the product development groups, and this was happening industry-wide, people were looking at making vape cartridges. And in order to put THC or CBD into a vape, you need to dissolve it in a vehicle, in an oil. And that oil comes from various different sources, and there are lots of different pros and cons of using these vehicles, because obviously that's getting inhaled at a certain temperature into the lung. And one of the vehicles that was being looked at was phytol. And I was asked to rule on whether we should be looking at phytol as an ingredient. Phytol is a naturally occurring cannabinoid. It's a clear liquid at room temperature, and it's got the right viscosity. It has all the right features that you would want from an oil to solubilize cannabinoids. But I said, no, let's run a preclinical study on this. If we don't know enough about phytol, we can't produce the drug that has this kind of thing without knowing what's in it. So we commissioned a group to look at the toxicity. This is a very well-established toxicology group in the US, and we ran a study looking at inhaled phytol compared to inhaled propylene glycol, which is a pretty standard oil used in a vehicle used in. And on day one, so I got a phone call from the lab when we ran the study. Those are the animals on day one exposed to inhaled phytol. On day two, that's what happened. So phytol never appeared in any single product. It was removed from anywhere to do with the infrastructure. But I produced this slide to remind us all that just because we think of naturally occurring compounds, and phytol is found in plant cannabis at less than 0.3%. But the fact that we have these compounds, the fact that we have these molecules out there and we think, oh, this would be great, let's use this, let's use that. We have to be very careful. Much of what we're doing of putting products and compounds into people at levels that they've never been done before. And just to assume that because a 0.1 milligram per kilogram is safe in an animal, or it's found naturally in the plant, to triple, quadruple, or worse, massively increase these amounts and give them to humans. We have to be very, very careful. And this was a very important warning lesson to us all. It, again, didn't make a big story. I was accused by other industry people of sabotaging the whole industry by doing studies, and the story is simple. It's if you want to know what you're doing, you've got to do the science. And so this was a particularly devastating result, and one that I will take with me for the rest of my life. I'm very glad that I made that call when I did. We ran studies looking at minor cannabinoids, because there's a lot of interest in CBN, CBG, CBC, CBDV, THCV, Delta 8, Delta 10, all of these minor compounds. But really, we need to stop and think. If we're developing these as medicinal products, if we expect to make claims, we've got to go back to the basics and do the preclinical toxicology required to justify the dosing, to understand how the drugs are metabolized. So we've done some of that work, and much of this is, you can see, these are all published in September of 2023. This is last month. So the studies are only just now, and anyone that works in academia knows how long it takes to get a paper through. But this is, at least we've put the data out there as best we can. CBD, oral minor cannabinoids in blood and brain, PK, toxicology and pain assessments of 4 minor cannabinoids, again in rat models, potential anxiolytic effects of minor cannabinoids and terpenes, and the crystal structure and binding of delta 10 THC. And this is the published work. I think everything else now has pretty much been published, and I leave it to you to take this information and go with it, run with it. I've kind of back to the clinic now, so less interest for me to take this work forward, but that's the building blocks of a drug development program that we've put out. In summary, oral toxicology of cannabidiol. So in summary of all of this work, what did we conclude? So we published a nice review in June of this year looking at the toxicity evaluation, and based on what we would consider standard pharmaceutical level toxicity criteria, we ran studies of CBD isolate in rats and found no major treatment-related effects up to the highest dose of 140 milligrams per kilogram in the plasma. So people who are taking CBD products from a whole plant extract are also likely to be taking THC, and as they take higher and higher doses, that THC can start to contribute to some of the pharmacological effects. So interesting takeaway data there, but I want to keep this in mind, this early adverse event experience. We went on to do studies of PK of cannabichromene. We discovered that one of our products has quite high levels of cannabichromene, so we ran a PK study on that. And we looked at THC. So this is Delta 8 THCV, which at the time was quite a popular product. A lot of people were excited about it, so we decided we should take a look at some two-phase dose-finding study in humans. And we also did some secondary analyses. There's a lot of interest in CBD products and bone metabolism, that CBD and even some THC products through their CB1, CB2 receptor activation can have effects on bone turnover, which if you're getting older and suffering with osteoporosis, there's a suggestion that that might be helpful. And we looked at bone marker in a secondary analysis in the phase 1 studies that we did. We were able to pull the data and look at some collagen bone markers, and it suggested that there might be some increase in the evidence of reducing resorption of bones, especially in males. But the data is there if anyone's interested in bone physiology. The clinical trials were another interesting experience. So again, all of that work not done in Canada. We tried to run clinical trials. And if you go on clinicaltrials.gov, you can see the studies that were listed and those that were canceled. But we had, and I won't go into specifics, but we had studies in pain, large phase 2B studies, so 60 to 100. We have one very large study in fibromyalgia, in pain conditions, mood disorders, and sleep disorders. And that was the original plan. All of those studies were canceled, either because of COVID, in one case, the sleep study, which was already recruiting, and we just simply had to stop it. The hospital was overwhelmed and stopped the study. And then the other studies were canceled because at the time we were getting regulatory approval from Health Canada to run these studies, we were able to submit the data that some of which wasn't available when we were doing these trials because, of course, the publications are only just out. But we tried to put dossiers together, say, we would like to do the study of this product in this condition. And we were allowed to do so for a couple of years. And then the goalposts moved. And we were told, well, no, now we want you to go back and do preclinical and phase 1 studies on any product that you're looking at for a clinical perspective. And at the time, I went back to the executives and I said, guys, if we're going to run these studies, we have to go back. We need to spend another couple of $1 million on phase 1 studies because the regulators have asked now to see this. And this is a time when COVID's hitting. There's been a change of management in the company. There's been budget crunches and the market is not working the way everybody hoped it would. So there's a fiscal tightening going on within the company. So talk about the wrong time to go to your CEO and ask for $2 million. I was told no. And in fact, at that point, the whole R&D program started to get reduced and the budgets were cut. And that was sort of the end of the large-scale clinical trials. That said, those were only the Canadian studies. So anything we were doing in the US continued. And we were able to do that because in the US, the Farm Bill, and I can't remember which year it was, somebody in here will know, but they allowed the extraction of CBD as an isolate from hemp. So CBD isolate from hemp was available to us, and we could get FDA approval, we could get INDs, we could run CBD isolate trials in the US, no problem. And we continue to do it. Some of these have now been published, and again, I invite you to read the papers. I won't go through it, except to very briefly, these were model studies so CBD and anxiety has been a big discussion point. People say they take CBD, it calms them down, they take it before an exam. There's a fairly big narrative out there about CBD reducing anxiety. We looked at a randomized double-blind trial of CBD, and this is oral CBD, 150, 300, 450 milligrams of CBD in fear elicited by a 10% CO2 enriched breathing challenge. This sounds horrible, but you put people in a room and you lower the amount, or you increase the amount of CO2 in the air, and they start to get short of breath, they can't breathe, and it's a ethically approved model for looking at anxiety. So we weren't breaking any rules, but these are students. And so they start to get panicky. But if you've given them in the 90 minutes before a good whack of CBD, can you reduce that anxiety? You're not harming them, but they're just getting anxious because they can't breathe. No effect. It was a negative trial. No dose did we find any effect on anxiety. Similarly, test anxiety, getting ready for an exam. Taking CBD before my exam is going to help me cope. No, negative study, couldn't find any effect, even up to 600 milligrams of oral CBD in a controlled trial of test anxiety. We saw some interesting stuff on nicotine withdrawal. This is just a signal, but we found that some of the higher doses, 450 milligrams of CBD, could affect nicotine withdrawal symptom severity. And again, if you're in the smoking world, you've probably seen this study, but I invite you to see that. It wasn't a controlled placebo-controlled trial, but we did explore it. And then we did a study that's only just come out October 5th on CBN with and without CBD on sleep. So finally, we started to get data coming out. But of course, it's years after the companies made decisions to move in different directions. Again, my credit to the team. We were determined to publish anything that we did. And that is why you're still seeing these studies coming out, even after most of the people that are involved in this work have left the company. Real-world evidence is another area of, how am I doing for time? I'm very worried that I'm going over. Oh, I'm halfway through? We're good? Real-world evidence is another area. And one of the nice things, and I heard Daniel say, we could achieve the regulations of the public health ambitions of legalization, but just by decriminalizing. Well, the problem with that is you don't have a product to give to people. And if you want to study the medical applications or the real impacts of products, you have to give them to people. You have to administer drugs to people and see what happens. And we can do all the reviews and all the analyses, but until you're doing prospective clinical trials, you aren't going to answer the important questions. So having a legal supply of product through a commercialized regulated model allows us to actually see what's happening when we give them. And the real-world evidence program, and this is something that I was very involved in long before my years with Canopy. If we're giving cannabis to patients, let's track their outcomes. Let's monitor them for their pain, their mood, their sleep, quality of life. And this is pretty consistent. But when you're dealing with an experimental therapy like a cannabinoid, it's even more important that you track the outcomes over time. And again, we did this with every patient, every clinical population where we could administer some form of long-term outcome follow-up. So we did this in Canada, we did it in Quebec, we did it in Australia. We have a study that I'll show you in Germany, which wasn't our product, but we did the same thing. But the opportunity to actually monitor real-world use in real-world settings, I think is a really unparalleled one, especially when you have a legal market with products that are actually being regulated and sold to patients. So we've run these studies. We've looked at patterns of utilization in health, in patients using cannabis for a wide range of reasons. And again, I don't have time, and because I want to get through some other material, to go through each one of these. And I'm standing in front of Jason Busa, who may be the biggest proponent for evidence-based medicine in the cannabis world. And I'm terrified that this data is full of so many holes, so much bias, that it's really limiting, and it's really quite intimidating to present it as anything other than, this is what we saw. This is simply what we saw. But where it does come into play is I hope to show you a little bit later on, is the safety aspect. But we looked at patients in Quebec. We looked at Australia, and when we launched these products in Australia, we worked with a clinical group there that monitored patients with us. And essentially, the bottom line is, reductions in those patients who continued, and about 30% of patients who initiate a cannabis product in a clinical setting will continue to be on it 3-6 months later. 70% of them stop. They don't like it, they didn't work, they couldn't afford it. For one reason or another, they drop out. But 30% of them do. And those that do typically show, and perhaps not surprising, they show improvements in their overall pain, their quality of life. There's some subtle changes in other aspects. But clearly they're continuing to use it because they think it's doing something. And we've shown this in multiple open label real world studies as well. We've looked at older people, because that was another area that we were quite impressed by, is how many older folks were coming into clinics asking to try cannabinoids for pain or for mood or sleep. So we did some subsequent analyses of the older patients, and we looked at this, by gender. And typically older people like oral products, they like CBD more, they tend to use it more for pain and sleep. An interesting project which we did, and again, I've put this in the real world evidence study, but there was a lot of interest in CBD and, what is the safe daily dose of CBD that humans can take? And we commissioned a toxicology group to use the preclinical data and all the clinical data we could find and say, well, from a non-medical standpoint, what would we consider a safe limit? And I noticed that the Cannabis Health Products Scientific Review Panel came out with their recommendations that 200 milligrams per day was considered to be a dose that was relatively safe, below which you were relatively safe. And I don't know the methodology, it wasn't published, but we did a study where we looked at the methods of determining what a safety is. And our finding was that 70 milligrams of CBD was the maximum daily dose, or what I should call the watchful dose, because in the opioid literature, we have a similar kind of concern that above a certain level of opioids and morphine equivalents per day, there's a risk. So we drew the line at 70, CHP's drawn the line at 200. I don't know where the true thing is, but the point is, with all the CBD that's out there, we need to be thinking carefully about when you're taking CBD in a drink and a gummy and a capsule, you may be taking more CBD per day than you realize. So we want people to recognize that, know how much CBD you're taking, calculate your daily dose, and eventually we'll come to some consensus on what is a reasonable daily amount. We looked at cannabis use disorder treatment preferences. I don't know this literature well, so if you're interested in this, please look at it. It's not a study that I can really defend up here. But the dronabinol study was one that we ran. Dronabinol was allowed in Germany as a pharmaceutical oily drops, they call it. So it's an oil and you put THC drops. It's pure THC, highly regulated. And the Germans are allowing it for pain management through pharmaceutical or through pharmacy distribution. And we thought, well, that's interesting. The Germans have allowed THC for pain. Since this is a pain meeting, I thought I would, spend a little bit of time telling you what we found there. So typically, and this was 600 patients, followed by the German Pain E-Registry. And the Germans have an amazing system of data collection. Talk about real-world evidence. They track the patients. There was a 70% retention rate. So 530 patients came at the end of the study, were still being followed, were still taking dronabinol, and significant reductions in pain, in mood, in sleep, reductions in their other medication use, reductions in their, not in their opioids, reductions in their other medication use. And this was quite a powerful study. And this wasn't a product that we even sold or made. It was simply looking at THC in this context. But the opportunity when you have regulated products being sold to patients to track their outcomes and look is unparalleled. All right, so now we've got beginning to emerge data, but we have doctors out in the community who are crying out saying, tell us how to use this, what dose, how do we start, what patient, I've got all these patients coming in, and I think I've heard it multiple times over the last 24 hours here, doctors don't know anything about cannabinoids. There's a lot that they can know if somebody was able to package it up and deliver it in a way. I think some of the data that we presented, and unless somebody has a motivation to present it, it's very difficult. The phase 1 studies never got in front of physicians. We were never able to present it because as a company, you're also regulated in what you can and cannot say to clinicians. You have to have a labeled claim, you have to have data that's approved, and then you can build your medical education based on what you're allowed to say. But there is none of that for cannabis. So we're very limited. But what we could do, and what we realized, and again, I know I'm going to get shot down for this, but what we did was, in the absence of evidence, was we called together as many clinicians as would agree to participate. And we said, tell us what you do. We can't tell you how to do this because we don't know and we're still trying to figure it out. But you're already out there doing this work. You're already prescribing cannabinoids to patients. There are clinics all over Canada, all over North America, all over the world delivering. So we pulled together who we felt were some of the more credible voices. And we put them in a room over a period of about 6 months, and we said, please help us understand how you're using these products. What do you do? How do you deliver this? The first time we did this was literally peak opioid crisis discussions. And we said people were claiming that they were using cannabinoids to reduce their opioids. And we thought, okay, clinicians are helping patients do this, and we need to help people wean off their opioids. How do we do it? A consensus Delphi method, so rounds and rounds and rounds of reviews and discussion, and consensus is eventually reached on how do you administer cannabinoids for the reduction of opioids. Now, this isn't based on randomized controlled data. This is based on consensus among treating clinicians. 5 to 20 milligrams of, where's my little pointer? 5 to 20 milligrams of CBD, no recommendation for evening, and then so it's always start with CBD, and this you'll see consistently coming back. Most clinicians recommend starting for almost anything with CBD, and then slowly increase 0.5 to 3 milligrams of THC, slowly increase over once or twice a week to a maximum of 30 to 40 milligrams, then consider opioid taping 5 to 10% of the morphine equivalent dose every 1 to 4 weeks, and follow up. And this was published in the International Journal of Clinical Practice, and it's out there. We can discuss the pros and cons, but at least it gave clinicians some kind of framework on which to base their approach. We did the same thing because we thought, okay, that's for opioid titration. What about for chronic pain? And this is an area very close to my heart. How do we initiate? And I do this in my own clinic. I had to figure out how to do this on my own. So we got another large group of clinicians together over about 6 months and went through, there's the process of Delphi evaluations over time. And they came up with a recommendation, again, starting for pain management. And there is very little, if any, and Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, CBD for chronic pain. I don't know if there's a really good, robust study on which to base this. But the clinical guidance among these people out there working in this field and working with patients was start with CBD predominantly, very low doses, 5 milligrams twice a day, increase up to 40 milligrams, then introduce THC at the starting dose of 2.5 milligrams and increase until the maximum dose. And this is kind of a working group, and there hadn't been many, there's been one other paper, I think, since this was published that sort of comes to very similar recommendations. But this is the guidance that's out there. We did some support for this. And again, as a company, you have to recognize you're not allowed to be in the discussion. We had no influence over the content or the deliberations. We were simply facilitating and watching this whole roll out. My friends and colleagues Kevin and Donald were very quick to jump on this and say this is not a substitute for randomized controlled trials. I agree completely, but I'm trying to do the trials. We're trying really hard to get that data. We're building on it. It's going to take years before we get there, but at least in the short term, we have something to work with. But clearly the guidance was there, and this was an editorial published in the Journal of Cannabis and Journal of Cannabis Research at the same time. Okay, so quick switch of gear, and then I'll leave time for questions. But I want to go through quickly this. One thing that people don't realize is that as a licensed producer of cannabis in Canada, you have an obligation to track adverse event reporting. It's a pharmacovigilance requirement, and there is guidance for that. When I started at Canopy, everybody in the company, we instituted a policy that on October the 18th, by the time legalization hit, everybody in the company had been trained on how to report an adverse event. 3,500 employees worldwide. Everybody had taken a half-hour online session on how to report an adverse event. Because I was very concerned. I was worried that the whole issue with opioids and the failure of our recognition of what happened with oxycodone and OxyContin was a failure of pharmacovigilance. It was happening, but it didn't get to the decision makers in time. And I wasn't going to let legal cannabis go out without having some degree of detection system in place to monitor. So everybody was trained in the company, and as a result of that, we had thousands of adverse event data coming in. Every month I was looking at summaries, I was looking at reviews. Every quarter we had all the serious adverse events collected. We had an independent scientific panel of international experts reviewing the serious adverse events. And the key thing was, is there something happening out there that we're not seeing or that we're not expecting that's going to come up and bite us in the butt? Is there some signal there that we're looking that we're not? Now that it's legal and being used by millions of people and we know what they're getting, that we can actually report. Luckily, a lot of this data, lawyers at the company are very protective of, for understandable reasons. But Health Canada, 15, thank you. Health Canada did me a good favor, and they published this came out at the end of 2022, their adverse event data from January to December of 2020. So let's take a walk through. I can't say for sure how much of this data we were responsible for, although let me just leave it at that. I don't want to say anymore, but I watched this data published very, very carefully. Here are the sources of the reports: community, hospital, cannabis. Now these are serious adverse events. So a serious adverse event, death, hospitalization, teratogenic effects, or something that the medical practitioner deems as being serious. It's not severe. Severe events, moderate or mild, is one thing. Seriousness has its own criteria. So these are the serious adverse events. 120 of them came from a cannabis or more than one cannabis license holder, and I'll leave it to you to figure out who that may have been. And here's the age group. These are the serious adverse events coming in. The couple, 3 under the age of 11, that were reported in this one-year review. But many of them came from older populations. And I'm quite struck by the number of serious adverse events occurring in people over the age of 50. Predominantly female, 57% female compared to 35% male. Route of administration, 80% oral. These are people taking oral products, having serious adverse events. A few of them, of course, inhaling and smoking, but there's quite a high proportion of oral products. And of the oral products, it's the ingestible liquid extracts that seem to be responsible for much of this. 104 serious cases. And this is what they're coded as. And based on Daniel's last presentation, I think there's one figure on here that's going to jump right out at you. Now, the coding of adverse events in a pharmaceutical world is very carefully done. Every event is captured and coded, and even the diagnosis. So these are the MEDRA terms, medical events. MEDRA is a medical dictionary of regulatory events. And hallucination appeared as the most common in these adverse events in the serious report. And so, okay, that's a concern, that it's a relatively small number over a 1 year period. 50, and hallucination, again, it's not psychosis. It's an event. It's something that have people seeing or hearing something funny, somebody that they thought was there that wasn't there. Lots of different definitions, but ultimately it ends up becoming called a hallucination. But look at the products that were responsible for or associated with the hallucinations. It's not just the high THC products. Half of them or more were CBD dominant or CBD leaning products. So people are having hallucination coming in with a serious hallucinatory adverse event using CBD or CBD dominant products. Gender analysis suggests, again, females more susceptible to these adverse events. We saw this in the phase 1 data. I've seen it in multiple other studies, but females, generally speaking, seem to have a higher rate of sensitivity to adverse events. And this shows up, especially in the older population. Look at the 45, 65, the gender difference is quite remarkable. Causality is the final piece, and any event is rated by the observer as to whether it was certainly caused by the product of interest, possibly, probably, or not at all. Most of these were possible or probable. There was very little certainty that this drug caused this problem among these. And this is the Health Canada report. So these are all regulated submissions. Final slide. And I've left this blank deliberately because I thought when I was doing this presentation, I thought, I don't even know what I've learned from those 5 years. We've looked at clinical trials. We tried to do them. We did preclinical studies. We put real world evidence in play. We looked at pharmacovigilance, and we continue to do that. What did we learn? I learned that there's a robust potential within industry to do really important science, to advance the knowledge and to run the clinical trials. They are the group that will do this work. And they're extremely smart and bright and motivated people. And my years there were remarkable. Having said that, we also need regulations that can allow that work to happen. Most of this was not done in Canada. It was done in Australia or the US. And that's a shame. 5 years after legalization, here we are talking about all this stuff and the advantages of having a legal framework. Hasn't translated into the ability to develop good medical, clinical science to advance the medical use of cannabis. It's been disappointing. And finally, just to leave open the fact that, we're not done yet. I think there's been a cycle of investment and it's certainly resettling, but it's not over. And I think we need a partnership between academia, between government, and between industry to work towards advancing the science. And if we do that, I think we may start seeing, perhaps in 5 more years, better data, better clinical trial work, and more emphasis on the medical use of cannabis, which we really haven't been able to advance very far in the last 5 years. Thank you very much.
Some online questions. Sorry to hear that your studies were canceled in Canada. Are you aware of another pathway for non-therapeutic research on cannabis frameworks to conduct human studies in Canada? And generally, how would someone best approach these?
Yeah, so I think the question about non-therapeutic use, so there was a change in the regulations at one point, because if you wanted to look at the onset of action of a beverage, so you're a company making a gummy or a beverage or a product, a new product, and you wanted to study the speed of onset. So say this drink is going to work within 10 minutes or 5, how long is it going to take? Even if you just wanted to know how long it took for your drink to THC beverage before you would expect this, you couldn't run that study unless you ran a clinical trial, because it was considered a clinical trial product. And so you had to go through the clinical trial application for a beverage, for a non-medical use. That got changed. So now you can do non-therapeutic studies, so looking at onset of action, as long as you're not making a claim that this is looking at pain or anxiety or something, speed of onset, duration of effect, those can now be done without necessarily having to file a clinical trial. That regulation just came in the last year and a half, so I don't know that that's necessarily yet translated into a massive flood of research into non-therapeutic claims, but it's allowed it. Even things like tasting products, there's a lot of food science involved in understanding what people like, mouthfeel and flavors and so on. So being able to do basic research on those now becomes possible. But it doesn't create, the only pathway through to pharmaceutical is through the Clinical Trials Directorate at Health Canada. And right now that remains the bar.
Okay. I've always wondered about opioid dose reduction protocol and the chronic pain treatment protocol from the Delphi exercises. How was the decision to use CBD predominant products at the outset arrived at when no evidence points to CBD as a potential useful agent in these two settings?
Don't know. That's what the clinicians came in and said. That's what they did. They have availability of product, and I don't know. It is the answer, and I can't defend it. I didn't base it on clinical trials, so it was based on experience, not evidence. End of story.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Do you have some specific recommendations about what government could do to allow more and better research so you don't have to do it outside Canada?
Yeah. I do. I don't know that this is the forum. I mean, there's a lot of nuance behind, developing regulations. I think ultimately, the quick answer to your question is the pharmaceutical drug development pathway, which is set up and structured for novel chemical entities. If I invent a new molecule and I want to put it into humans for treating their neuropathic pain, I follow the path because this drug's never been in humans. My concern with cannabinoids is that with many of them, with the exception of the minors and some of the other products where we're now talking about much higher doses, but for most THC and CBD products, we've got a long history of human use. And I think that deserves to be considered in the safety profile. So sending us back to do preclinical tox studies on every THC and CBD molecule that's coming through is probably not necessary. We can move into phase 1, phase 2 studies now with existing data. So there should be some accommodation for that. The other thing I think is there are so many different people using cannabinoids for different purposes that to expect a large-scale RCT on every single subgroup of patients that are doing it is going to be very, very hard to do. I'd love to see a world where you could do a smaller study, a phase 2B type study in a condition of interest. And if you see a positive signal, coupled with robust pharmacovigilance, you could allow that product to be used by that population and monitored for a period of time until the Sativex did this with MS. When they launched Sativex with the spray, the standardized pharmaceutical extract of CBD, they were given a notice of compliance with conditions by Health Canada, which meant that they had to do further studies, continue to monitor. So there are pathways which allow for some exceptional status. And I think we need to sit with the regulator and say, okay, what is an acceptable level of evidence to allow us to put a small claim on a product that this can help with your sleep, or this might help with your pain or joint stiffness, which is where you can go into the pharmacy and buy products that have those claims on the label through the Natural Health Products Directorate. Is there a cannabis products directorate that could be evolved that would allow us to put those in the pharmacy with a medical claim, with a prescription? That, I think, is the future.
So, thank you. I had some trauma listening to your talk about our own experiences trying to get research going. So just to emphasize this, when Canada said, we need evidence here to try to drive practice for all the reasons that so many speakers have talked about today, and they release funding and they release these products. I mean, any adult with a credit card and an internet connection can have these things brought to their home to use for whatever indication they want. Unfortunately, we can't do the research to tell them if there's any effect or not. And when James and I sort of started down this journey, we were meeting with, literally hundreds of these licensed producers, people coming from the US to say, we see huge opportunities in Canada. We can't do this research in the US. Let's get going. Yeah. And we could not find a product that Health Canada would let us administer in a clinical trial. It was extraordinarily painful. So again, I echo your experiences. But what comes to mind to me, sort of seeing you put up slide after slide after slide of all these studies, preclinical, RCTs, observational data, is there was a huge push to try to fill that information gap, which Canopy was engaged at one time, and they were sort of letting this happen. They've now shut down this program, and I wonder if you see an opportunity for another entity, another industry part, someone to sort of take up this sort of mantle to sort of get this information out there, or has the lesson been from your experience to industry, stay away from this? This is simply the third rail.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm an optimist at heart, and I think that there's still a long way to go. And we saw a bit of a bubble, and it settled back down. And I think the patient demand for new products, for pain, for anxiety, we have a world that's in pain. And we need ways to address that. And drugs are one approach, whether they be cannabinoids or whatever. There's a lot of other stuff that we need to work on, and lifestyle changes and social determinants. There's a lot of work to do. And I don't think, I'm not going to stand here and say that I think cannabinoids are going to be the answer. But they deserve to be part of the toolbox. And there's enough data there, I think, for patients who tried everything else. And I think, Jason, your work helps me say this, is that there's a role for people to consider a cannabinoid at some point during their journey. Is that ever going to get picked up and moved up the scale with better data, with better trials, where we move it to a second line agent, or is it become the first line? There needs to be that need, and then the need exists. There needs to be the industry interest, which I think exists. The missing piece, and it's a little bit related to that last question, the goalposts for for an industry to develop a drug to get to the market. They need to know clearly 5 years down the road what it is they have to produce, and then they hire the people and they grind it out and they get there. If you don't know where the goalposts are, or they keep moving on you, and there's no way anyone's going to commit budgets to do this this is tens of millions of dollars of money going into this stuff. So how do you get industry interested? You have clear regulatory pathways that say you will be allowed to sell your product with this claim, with this thing. If you produce this data, then let them go. And I think they will.
Maybe just one small follow-up as well. So we see there's hundreds of thousands of Canadians that have authorization to use these products. Many more are using them without this authorization. So the use is there. Industry has the potential to be interested if the system changes in such a way to sort of encourage that. Yeah. The other voice that's out there is the voice of the clinicians. You've mentioned this huge, pressing need to sort of come up with strategies for chronic pain. I still remember back in October 2018 when cannabis became available for non-medical purposes, senior leadership from the CMA was standing up and saying, no need for us to be involved in this space anymore now that cannabis is available for non-medical purposes. Is there enough interest that you've seen amongst clinicians to sort of start to get more engaged in this space and demand better evidence so they can help their patients that in many cases are already using these products to make the decision whether they should be using these products or not?
Yeah, so the interest from clinicians. So there's definitely a continuing small body of dedicated clinicians who work in cannabis clinics, who are working in units like mine, who have a special interest in cannabinoids, who work in palliative care settings. There's a body of physicians, and they're fairly well entrenched and well established. And they've just developed the comfort level. But for the remaining 65,000 physicians in Canada who don't, yes, the CMA's resistance or active, unengagement in medical cannabis policy just sort of sends them a message like, we don't need to know anything about this. My challenge is that we're talking about medical patients and medical access and people who come with a symptom saying, is cannabis right for me? My worry is that Canadian physicians need to know about cannabis, not just because of the medical channel, but because it's out there, it's everywhere. And because we have people going to hospitals, and because we have people, overdosing or people taking it and doing things that they shouldn't, then the clinician is the source of information and guidance. If you go to your doctor and say, I've got this kind of thing, what can I do? Can I drive? Is it safe for me to take this home? And the clinician simply has no idea. I think we're doing the patients a disservice, and we're doing our clinicians a disservice. This is a fascinating drug and class of compounds. Every clinician in Canada should be able to speak somewhat knowledgeably about what cannabis is and what it can do. This conference is a good part of that, but we're talking to a tiny, tiny proportion of people who need to know this information. So getting it out there is the clutch thing, and the CMA could do a lot more to engage in that process.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your presentation and your perspective. I was curious, in terms of the pharmacovigilance and the adverse effects that were noted, do you know what fraction may be attributed to perhaps indirect effects from adverse drug interactions, for example, especially for older patients?
Yeah, it's really hard to capture. The adverse event report, especially the serious ones, is a pretty complex document. You go and you look at all the other products. And for most of these patients, they were on, most of them came from the medical stream. Most of them were on other products at the same time. It wasn't possible, and I don't think Health Canada tried to do this within their review to tease out the potential crossing over. But we had a panel of people who looked at all the serious adverse events every quarter, and we tried to see, is there anything here that looks like it could be related to a possible interaction? By and large, we didn't see any strong signals suggesting that was happening.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.